The banker read the figure aloud as though it settled something. $312. He said it the way a man says a word in a foreign language, carefully, with a small satisfaction at his own precision. And then he turned the ledger so she might see the number written there, in ink, so fresh it still held a faint shine. She did not look at the ledger. She was looking past him, past the gatepost with its rusted hinge, past the yard where the October grass had gone the color of old straw. She was looking at the door set into the hillside, the low plank door with its iron latch, banked on three sides by sod that had grown over the frame in a kind of slow embrace. The cattle dog had gone ahead of her, as he always did. He sat beside the door now, thick-coated and unhurried, his brindle shoulders square to the world, as though he had been asked to guard something, and took the charge seriously. The banker followed none of this. He was still speaking. The terms were not complicated, he said. The note had been in arrears since March. The bank had sent notice in July and again in August. Both letters returned unclaimed. He was not here to cause difficulty. He was here because it was Tuesday, and on Wednesday morning he intended to file at the county seat, and that would be the end of it. The wind came off the plain in a long, level push, and the dry grass in the yard bent all at once and straightened again. The old cow shifted in the low sod barn to the left, and the widow heard her without turning, the weight and the quiet complaint of her, the familiar sound of an animal resettling its patience. 3 years she had worked this ground alone. 3 years of mornings that began before light and ended after it, of carrying what needed carrying, and mending what needed mending, and making do in the spaces between. The frame house behind her was plain and weather-scoured, but sound. The barn was leaning at the north corner, which she intended to address before the ground froze. The root cellar, the cellar the banker had not yet seen, had not yet troubled himself to see, waited in the hillside with its iron latch and its plank door, and the dog sitting patient beside it, as he had sat every morning for 18 months while she worked inside. The banker closed his ledger. The brass clasp caught the pale autumn light for a moment, and then was still. She turned to him then, not with anger. There was no anger in her face, or none that showed, but with the particular attention of a woman who has decided that something is about to be made clear. She asked him a single question. She asked him if he had seen the cellar. He had not. He said so with a small frown, as though the question were slightly beneath the occasion. She said that he should. She led him toward the hillside, and as she walked she was somewhere else for a moment. Not gone, not absent, but layered, the way old wood is layered, the present grain and the older grain beneath it, both true at once. 3 years prior, the debt had been a fact laid on the kitchen table the same morning they laid her husband in the ground. $312. She had read the figure from the bank's letter herself, because the neighbor who brought it assumed she could not, and she had folded it along its crease and set it beneath the salt crock without a word. That evening she had fed the old cow. The cow had not known anything had changed except the hands, and perhaps she had not even known that. The house had been quiet in the way that houses go quiet when the breathing that filled them is gone. She had sat with the coal oil lamp burning low, lamp oil was already a calculation, and tried to think past the size of the number. $312 was 6 seasons of butter, 8 seasons, if the cow held. It was not a number that could be worked at from the front of it. She had understood that clearly. She had not planned to open the butter churn that night. She had reached for it without thinking, the way the hands move toward familiar objects when the mind is elsewhere, and when she lifted the lid, there was the smell of old wood and dried cream, and there was also, pressed flat against the curved interior, browned at the edges from years of close air, a folded sheaf of paper she had not known was there. Her mother's hand. She had recognized it before she read a word of it. The letters small and slanted, the pen pressed firmly, the way her mother had written everything, as though the paper might resist her, and she intended to be clear. The pages were notes. Not a letter, not a farewell, but working notes. A method. Measurements in the old Swiss weights her mother had still thought in, translated in the margins to American measures in a second, younger ink, as though her mother had revised them once and meant them to be used. Milk volumes, salt ratios, temperatures described in relation to seasons rather than degrees. Cool as a stone floor in October, no warmer. Turning schedules, rind notes, the names of molds written in a careful hand as though they were the names of neighbors worth knowing. She had read them through twice by lamplight, then a third time more slowly. She had not cried. She was not certain now whether that was strength or simply the body's mercy in sparing what it cannot afford to spend. She had folded the pages and held them flat against her chest for a while, the lamp guttering beside her, the house saying nothing around her. Then she had set the pages on the table and smoothed them open and read them once more, practically now, the way a woman reads a set of instructions she intends to follow. She began the next morning, before the light had fully settled into the kitchen. The instructions called for whole milk, unhurried heat, and patience with the curd, 3 things she had in varying supply. The milk she had, drawn in the gray pre-dawn from the old cow, whose breath had hung in small clouds above the frost-stiffened grass. The heat she could manage, the patience she was still learning to distinguish from exhaustion. She scalded the milk slowly in the largest pot, watching the surface for the faint shimmer her mother's notes described as the moment before, not boiling, not still, something in between that required attention rather than measurement. She caught it, or thought she did, and added the rennet, a small careful pour, and waited while the pot sat covered on the back of the stove. The curd, when it came, was soft and uncertain. She cut it in the pattern her mother had drawn with a careful sketch, long strokes, then cross strokes, then left to settle again. She ladled it into the cloth with hands that shook slightly from cold and from the specific nervousness of attempting something irreversible. She tied the cloth's corners and hung it to drain from the rafter hook, and stood beneath it for a long moment, watching the first pale whey drip into the bowl below. She pressed it that afternoon under a flat stone from the creek bed, cleaned and dried and heavy enough to matter. She checked the weight. She checked it again. She unwrapped it at evening, and what she found was closer to a mistake than a wheel. Crumbling at one edge, too dry, the rind not holding. She made a note in the margin of her mother's instructions. Too much heat in the pressing room, she thought, or too little in the curd. She tried again. The second wheel cracked across the face within a week of setting. She recorded this too, without sentiment, in the small space beside her mother's neat hand. The third wheel held its shape but smelled wrong, sharp where it should have been mellow, thin where it should have been rounded. She cut a sliver and tasted it and set it aside and stood at the cellar door for a while, looking out at the flat country beyond the sod barn, where the old cow moved in slow, deliberate circles through the grass. The dog pressed against her calf. She did not look down at him. She was thinking about the note her mother had written in the margin about mold, that certain molds were not enemies but slow collaborators, working at their own pace toward something she could not rush. She went back inside. She adjusted the salt. She adjusted the turning schedule by 1 day. She rubbed the linen more carefully with the rendered lard, working it into the weave with her thumb until the cloth felt almost waterproof in her hands. The fourth wheel she set on the shelf and did not touch for 2 weeks. When she finally descended to check it, the dog went first. The fourth wheel held. That was the word she returned to in the months that followed. Held, as though the cheese were something structural, something that bore weight rather than merely aged. The rind firmed slowly over the following weeks, going from pale and yielding to a surface that resisted her thumbnail with quiet authority. She descended every 3rd day to turn it, the lantern swinging from her left hand, the dog's nails clicking against the stone steps ahead of her. By the time the cold deepened into the hard iron of a plains winter, She had 4 wheels on the shelf, each at a different stage, each turned on its own schedule, recorded in the small notebook she kept on the kitchen windowsill. The notebook had been her mother's. The handwriting on the early pages was her mother's, careful, European, precise, and then partway through, her own hand appeared, rounder and more uncertain at first, then steadier as the months accumulated. 6 months in, she carried the first wheel she trusted completely down the cellar stairs and set it on the lowest shelf. She had chosen the lowest shelf deliberately. Her mother's notes were clear on this. The cold settled at the bottom, the air was most consistent there, the fluctuations that rose with the seasons were smallest, nearest the floor. She placed the wheel on a clean cedar board she had cut and planed herself, set it level with a small spirit level she had kept from her husband's toolbox, and then she stood back and held the lantern up and looked at it. The cellar received her attention without comment. Stone walls on 3 sides, fitted close enough that the seams were thin, but not close enough to stop moisture. She could see it even now. Dark lines of damp between the rocks, a slow, cold exhalation from the hillside itself. The shelving was pine, dried and rough, smelling faintly of the sawmill still after 2 years. On the far wall, the iron hook her husband had driven into the mortar. She hung the lantern there when she needed both hands free, and the light it cast was amber and uneven, pulling shadows from the wheel's cloth wrapping in long, soft shapes. The smell in the cellar was its own country, brine and earth, and something deeper underneath, a ferment that was not rot, but was not entirely comfortable either, the smell of something alive and working in the dark, without her permission or her oversight. The dog sat at the foot of the stairs and watched her. She turned the wheel once, just to feel the weight of it, 12 pounds approximately, dense and satisfying in her hands. Then she set it back on the cedar board and adjusted the linen at one edge where it had begun to gap. Every 3rd day after that, she descended. Not every 2nd day when she was eager, not every 4th when she was tired. Every 3rd day, in the morning before the other work, by lantern light, she turned each wheel in careful sequence and noted the date beside it in the small notebook. She told no one. The summer came in hard and stayed. By July, the grass along the creek had gone the color of old straw, and the flat country around the homestead shimmered in the midday heat with a quality that was less like warmth than like pressure, the sky bearing down, the earth bearing up, and nothing soft between. The old cow stood at the fence line each morning and regarded the dried pasture with a patience that looked, in certain lights, like resignation. Her milk came thinner as the weeks wore on. Not absent, not stopped, but changed in the way that lean seasons change everything. Quietly, incrementally, without announcement. The widow noticed before the first week of the change had passed. She measured the yield each morning in the same tin pail, and she knew the pail's weight by feel, the way she knew the weight of each cheese wheel by feel, intimately, without needing to think about it. When the yield dropped, she adjusted. She had learned the recipe from her mother, but she had always known that a recipe was not a law. It was a starting point. Her mother had pressed cheese in a green Swiss valley where the summer rain was reliable and the herd grazed on deep grass until September. This was not that valley. The land here asked different things, and she had long since stopped being surprised by that. She reduced the rennet by a quarter, just a quarter, no more, and extended the pressing time by 2 hours, setting stones from the dry creek bed atop the mold form when she ran short of counterweights. The result was a firmer curd, denser, with less moisture than her earlier wheels. She worried over it for a week, checking the rind formation in the cellar each evening, with the lantern held close and her thumbnail pressed gently into the surface, testing for the particular resistance that meant all was proceeding as it should. The dog descended the cellar stairs with her every time, moving carefully on the stone steps, his low body almost disappearing into the shadow before the lantern light caught his brindle coat and turned it amber. He would circle once at the bottom, nose working over the packed earth floor, and then settle near the foot of the stairs and watch her with the unhurried attention that animals bring to things they have decided are important. She noted each rind with her thumb and recorded the finding in the small notebook with the same brief shorthand she always used: a letter for the texture, a number for the day in the sequence, a mark if she had found anything that needed watching. The notebook was precise and almost unreadable to anyone but herself, which suited her. By August, she had accepted that the dry summer wheels would be different, not lesser, different, firmer through and through, with a dryness at the edge that she suspected would deepen into something almost crystalline after enough time in the cool dark. She set them back on their cedar boards and climbed the stairs to her other work, the dog at her heels. The banker arrived at mid-morning with his leather-bound ledger under one arm and the particular expression of a man who has already decided what he will find. He walked the perimeter of the frame house first, pausing at the corner where the siding had warped and not yet been replaced, making a note with his pencil that he did not try to conceal. He moved to the sod barn and stood in the doorway without entering, as though the smell of it confirmed something he had suspected from the road. The old cow watched him from her stall with the level, incurious gaze she gave to everything she did not consider a threat. He did not seem to notice the cow at all. The widow walked 2 paces behind him throughout, the dog at her heel, neither of them offering anything the man had not asked for. He had not asked for much. He spoke mostly to his ledger, in the manner of someone narrating a document rather than conducting a conversation, and what he narrated was a catalogue of deficiencies: the uneven yard, the fence post listing at the southwest corner, the absence of a second outbuilding he seemed to feel should have been there. When they reached the cellar door set into the hillside, he stopped and looked at it the way a man looks at something he expects to dispose of quickly. The dog descended first, as he always did, his nails clicking softly on the stone steps before the lantern light reached him. The banker followed, ducking his head at the low lintel, and stood at the bottom with his ledger pressed against his chest, as though protecting it from the air. The air was cool and damp, with the smell of brine and ripening rind, and something underneath that was older than either, the particular smell of stone that has held a constant temperature for decades. He looked at the walls where moisture pressed between the joints. He looked at the wooden shelving on 3 sides, at the single iron hook from which the widow had lifted the lantern. A moldy hole, he said. It was not quite addressed to her. It was the kind of remark a man makes to his own ledger, to the record he is building. I've seen root cellars maintained. This is not a maintained root cellar. He lifted his pencil. The shelving alone is a liability. And whatever you've got wrapped up there, he gestured with the pencil's eraser end toward the cloth-wrapped forms ranked along the cedar boards, that is a health concern. I'll need to note that. Spoiled stores on the premises will affect the assessed value of... She did not argue with him. She lifted the lantern from its hook and held it at shoulder height, and the light moved across the 14 wrapped wheels in a slow, even arc, catching the undyed linen and the careful way each one sat on its board. Count them, she said. Her voice was quiet and without edge. It was simply an instruction, offered in the same tone she used when checking her own notebook, brief, exact, expecting to be followed. He counted them. She watched him do it, his lips moving slightly as his pencil touched the edge of each board in turn, a small tap against the cedar. 1, 2, 3. As if the act of numbering might reduce what he saw to something manageable, something already categorized and dismissed before the count was finished. He moved along the shelving slowly, not because he was careful, but because the cellar floor was uneven and he did not trust it, and the brindle dog sat at the base of the stairs and watched him with the patient, unblinking attention of an animal that has learned the difference between a threat and an inconvenience. 14, the banker said at last. He wrote it in the leather-bound ledger, the brass clasp catching the lantern light for a moment as he opened it flat against his forearm. He wrote the number with the same pencil he had used to note the shelving, the moisture in the walls, the smell he had called a health concern. 14 units, she heard him say under his breath, perishable stores, condition unknown. Condition unknown. She set the lantern back on its hook without haste, and then she lifted the nearest wheel from its board, the oldest one, the one she had set down first, 18 months prior, before the leaves had turned that first autumn, before she had known whether the cold in these stone walls would hold true through July heat. She had turned it 3 days after she laid it down, and every third day since, without exception, the way her mother had shown her, the way her mother's hands had moved in the cool cellar of a farmhouse none of them would ever see again. She set the wheel on the edge of the board and drew the small paring knife from her apron pocket. The cut she made was thin, a sliver, not a demonstration. She was not performing for him. She held it out on the flat of the blade and said nothing, because there was nothing that required saying. He looked at the knife. He looked at the pale interior of the wheel, at the slight crystalline roughness that had formed along the cut edge, where the aging had done its long, unhurried work. He did not take it. He made a small sound in the back of his throat, not quite refusal, not quite revulsion, and turned toward the stairs, his ledger already closing. She held the knife steady. It was the dog that moved first, shifting toward the foot of the stairs, and then above them, at the open square of gray autumn sky, a shadow fell across the threshold. A man stood at the top of the cellar steps, stocky, road-dusty, a leather satchel slung across one shoulder, and he had stopped to let his eyes adjust to the dark below, and he was looking at the knife, and at what rested on it, with an expression that was not politeness or hunger, but something more considered than either. He came down one step, then another. He came down another step, and then he was fully in the cellar, and the banker had to press himself sideways against the stone wall to allow the passage, which he did, with visible irritation and no greeting. The newcomer did not acknowledge him. His eyes had already moved past the knife, past the widow holding it, to the shelving along the far wall, to the 14 cloth-wrapped wheels sitting in their patient rows, and something in his posture changed the way a hunting dog's posture changes when it scents what it came for. He set his leather satchel on the lowest step and opened it without ceremony. From inside he withdrew a small roll of oilcloth, which he unrolled on the step beside him to reveal a set of fine wire loops mounted in wooden handles, tasting wires, thin as sewing thread, each one a slightly different gauge. He selected one without looking up. He crossed to the shelf and stood before the nearest wheel a long moment before touching it. Then he pressed 2 fingers against the linen cloth and held them there, reading something through the fabric that was not visible. He lifted the wheel. The widow watched him gauge its heft without comment, and set it carefully on the shelf's edge. He unwrapped the linen with the same deliberation she used when she turned them, folding the cloth back rather than pulling it away, exposing the rind in sections. The rind was the color of old straw going to amber, dry at the surface and faintly rough where the natural coat had formed over 18 months. He bent close. He did not touch it yet. He only looked, tilting his head until the lantern light crossed the wheel at an angle that showed the texture, even, uncracked, with no soft patches and no blooming of unwanted mold at the seams. Then he pressed his thumb against the side of the wheel, not hard, just enough to test, and when he lifted his thumb, he brought it slowly to his nose. He held it there for several seconds. His eyes did not close. He was not performing any more than she had been. He took the tasting wire and set it against the rind at the wheel's midpoint, angled it slightly, and drew it through in a single slow pull. The wire parted the cheese cleanly, and he lifted the small core it had extracted and held it to the lantern. The interior was pale gold, faintly granular, with the crystalline flecks of long aging distributed evenly through the grain, not clustered, not absent, but threaded through the whole like salt worked into good leather. He pressed the core between his thumb and forefinger. A faint trace of moisture rose to the surface. He assessed it the way a man assesses a distance before committing to the crossing, neither hurried nor theatrical, and then he brought it to his lips. The cellar was very quiet. Above them, somewhere in the yard, the old cow moved, and the sound of her bell came down through the open square of sky like something dropped from a long way off. The cheesemonger set the tasting wire down across the top of the wheel with the care of a man returning a borrowed tool. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the wheel for a moment, the way a person looks at a letter they have already understood but wish to read once more before answering. Then he asked about the cloth. She told him, undyed linen, cut from bolts her mother had brought west in a dry goods trunk, each piece washed in clean water and dried flat before use. She told him about the lard seal, rendered twice, skimmed clean of all impurity, worked into the cloth by hand while still warm, so that it set into the weave rather than lying on its surface. Her mother had been particular about this. The seal was not decoration. It was the difference between a rind that breathed and a rind that suffocated, and a wheel that breathed would tell you when it was ready, if you were patient enough to listen. The cheesemonger asked about temperature. She gestured at the walls around them, the stone, the moisture threading between the joints, the particular stillness of the air at 6 feet below the surface of the earth. In summer, the cellar ran cool enough that she could see her breath on warm mornings when she descended. In winter it never froze. Her husband had thought it a poor use of the hillside. She had thought otherwise, and had said nothing, and had waited. He asked about the turning schedule. Every third day, she said, without exception. She had not missed a turning in 18 months. She had turned the wheels sick with influenza one February, and again through a week of ice storms when the path to the cellar door had to be cleared by hand each morning before dawn. She recited this not as complaint and not as claim to extraordinary effort. It was simply the schedule the method required, and she had kept it. The cheesemonger was quiet for a moment, looking at the shelves, at the 14 wheels arranged in their precise order. He had his worn ledger open now, not reading it, only holding it, the same way she sometimes held her mother's recipe notes without looking at them, for the weight of the thing rather than its contents. She answered each question in the same register, plain, direct, exact. Her mother had taught her that imprecision in the method produced imprecision in the result, and that pride was a form of imprecision. It blurred what was actually there with what you wished were there. She had no wish to impress the man. She had only the work, and the work was already finished, and it would answer for itself. At the top of the cellar stairs, the banker stood with his arms folded across his chest, and the leather-bound ledger closed against his side, its brass clasp catching the last of the afternoon light. He went to the oldest wheel first. She had told him which it was. The one farthest left on the lowest shelf, turned every third day for 18 months without a single interval missed, and he crouched before it with the particular attention of a man who has learned to let the object speak before he forms an opinion of it. He drew the tasting wire from his coat pocket, a thin loop of bright metal on a wooden handle, and worked it through the wheel with practiced care, extracting a small core no thicker than a finger. He held it to the lantern light. He brought it close and considered it the way a man considers handwriting he almost recognizes. She stood 2 steps back and said nothing. He tasted the core. He was still for a moment, then made a small sound. Not surprise exactly. More the sound a person makes when a thing confirms what they had barely allowed themselves to hope. He set the core on the clean cloth he had spread across his knee and opened his ledger. He wrote something. He moved to the next wheel. He examined all 14 in the same manner, unhurried, recording his notes in a column she could not read from where she stood. The brindle dog had settled near the bottom stair, watching the cheesemonger the way it watched weather, steady, without judgment, tracking something the humans had not yet named aloud. The lantern swayed once in a draft that came down from the open cellar door above, and the shadows shifted across the stone walls, and then steadied again. When he reached the fourth wheel from the left end of the lowest shelf, the youngest of what she considered her finished stock, he paused and looked back at her. He said, "The first four, the oldest four." He meant the question without asking it directly, and she answered by moving forward and indicating each one in turn. He crouched before them again, consulting his column of notes, adding figures she could hear him working through quietly beneath his breath. He straightened. He looked at the ledger, then at the four wheels, then at his own handwriting. He said that each wheel at trade price would bring between $80 and $90 in the territorial capital. Eastern accounts paid more. There were Eastern accounts. But at trade price, the four together would return between $320 and $360. He said this plainly, as a figure, the way a fair man states what a thing is worth without ornamentation. She heard it land in the cool air of the cellar and stay there. $320 at the low end. The debt on the ledger upstairs was $312. She did not say this aloud. There was no need to say it aloud. He had already done the arithmetic, and above them both, at the top of the stairs, so had the banker. The cheesemonger did not move immediately toward the stairs. He remained where he was, crouched at the level of the four wheels, and drew from his coat an inner pocket she had not noticed before, a small leather sleeve no wider than a man's palm, and from it removed a folded sheet of paper, already printed with column headings. A contract form, she understood. He carried them ready. He was not a man who waited for certainty before preparing for it. He set the paper against his knee and wrote in the first column with a short pencil, reading the figures aloud as he entered them. 4 wheels per season, first delivery on acceptance of terms. Trade price at the low end of the range he had quoted, held fixed for 2 seasons as an opening term, subject to renegotiation at the third. Payment on delivery to his agent at the territorial depot, receipt issued same day. He read it back to her in full, without hurry, the way a man reads a thing he expects to stand behind. She listened. She looked once at the 4 wheels beside him, then at the page, then at his face. He was watching her, the way the dog watched unfamiliar things, steadily, without presumption. She nodded once. He wrote her nod into the record the only way it could be recorded. He signed his own name at the bottom and held the page toward her. She took it, and the pencil, and signed where the line indicated. The paper went back into the leather sleeve. They came up the stairs together, the dog first, then her, then him with the lantern. The yard light was lower now, the afternoon leaning west, and the air outside the cellar felt thin after the dense cold below. The banker was standing where they had left him. He had not moved toward the house. He held his ledger against his forearm, the brass clasp catching what remained of the light. The cheesemonger drew from his outer coat a second paper, a written valuation, she saw, already completed in full, and handed it without comment to the banker. The banker read it. He read it again. His expression did not collapse or harden, it simply settled into something quieter than what it had been, the way a fire settles when the wood has burned down to coal. He opened the ledger. He uncapped the small ink pen he carried clipped inside the cover. The general storekeeper, who had drifted without announcement to the yard's edge, stood with his hat in both hands. Beside him, close enough to read the page if she chose, the schoolteacher had gone still. The banker wrote. He wrote 2 words and a figure and the date, and then he closed the clasp. He did not look up immediately. When he did, there was no one in the yard who required him to speak. The widow moved first. She did not wait for the banker to find words he did not have, nor for the cheesemonger to prompt her, nor for the small gathered assembly at the yard's edge to offer the nod that would signal she had permission to continue her own life. She simply turned toward the low table she kept beside the cellar door, a length of pine board on 2 sawhorses, worn pale by years of use, and took from the shelf above it a length of clean, undyed linen she had folded there that morning, as she folded one every morning, the way her mother had taught her to keep cloth ready for the work that comes whether you are prepared or not. She lifted the nearest wheel from the plank where the cheesemonger had set it after his tasting. 12 pounds, or close to it. She no longer had to think about the weight. Her hands knew it the way her hands knew the handle of the milk pail, the heft of the turning cloth, the exact pressure required to smooth lard along a rind without breaking the seal. She laid the wheel at the linen's center. She folded the cloth over, corner to corner, the way a letter is folded when the writer means it to hold. The cheesemonger accepted it with both hands. He settled it into the crook of his arm as one carries something of genuine value, and he inclined his head once. Not a bow, not a performance, only the small motion a man makes when he means what he has said and requires no further occasion to repeat it. His worn ledger went back into his outer coat. The tasting wires he returned to their case. The old cow lowed from somewhere behind the sod barn. It was the low she made in late afternoon when the light had shifted and she had decided, with the authority of an animal who has organized her days by the same hours for years, that the day's commerce was finished and the yard should settle. The brindle dog had already found the cellar stairs. He stood at the top of them, looking back at her. Not waiting, exactly, only marking her position the way he always did, his broad chest and low center steady as a door lintel. She walked to the stairs. Behind her, she heard the general storekeeper say something to the schoolteacher in a low voice. She did not hear what. It did not matter what. What mattered was the cool air rising from below, carrying brine and linen, and the slow mineral breath of stone walls that had held through 3 winters and would hold through more. She set her foot on the first step. The dark below was familiar. The turning still waited, patient, exact, unhurried, and there was work enough left in the season to fill a ledger